Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another lecture for Crit 310 Identity, Multiculturalism, and Empire. Today, we're going to be continuing our discussion of what it means to decolonize the mind using Pater Panchali as an example. And then from there, we're going to move into a broader discussion about film and photography. And we'll also be reading for Friday two short texts, which I think will also help to shed some more light on that subject matter. But first, return to Pater Panchali. Just as a reminder, this is a picture of Satyajit Ray behind his movie camera. He was not only a filmmaker, but also a music composer, a graphic artist, a screenwriter, etc. He was born in Calcutta, which, just to remind you, is right around here in the state of West Bengal, which is in India. And in fact, West Bengal was once part of the larger state of Bengal, which later became divided to form East Pakistan and eventually Bangladesh. So he would have been from the same cultural part of the world as the Iqbals, as the characters, the fictional characters that we've been reading about for the last few weeks from Zadie Smith's White Teeth. Satyajit Ray is important because he was a prolific filmmaker who came of age at the same time that his country gained its independence, but he's also important because he was one of the fathers of what is known as the parallel cinema movement. We talked last time about how parallel cinema was moving away from the sort of escapist, fantasy-driven, oftentimes musical, oftentimes quite high budget and large in scale Bollywood movies. Parallel cinema was about not only kind of state-funded, lower budget films, but specifically about realism in direct opposition to escapism, about the kind of slow pacing that reflects the lived experience of everyday life, as opposed to these fast-paced musicals or these epics that span 20 years in an hour. And also, sort of in contradistinction to Bollywood cinema, which tended to rely on big movie stars as draw for audiences, parallel cinema was about also using sort of authentic action. And so oftentimes parallel cinema films would employ non-actors, would employ sort of regular people to represent regular people. And that was the case in Pater Panchali as well, which I mentioned before. In particular, the child actors in the film were just children, just Bengali children who Rai chose to star in his film. Also, as a reminder, the specific film Pater Panchali, which is the first of a 3-part series, was based on a short story by the same name, which was published in the 1920s, which Satyajit Ray had been involved in adapting into picture book form as an illustrator. If we remember that the story upon which Pater Panchali was based was written in 1928, we understand that this narrative actually predates independence. So that tells us that this is a story that was written during the colonial period, that the story itself takes place under the British Raj. Now, the question that I have for you, one of the questions I have for you, is what impact do the actual forces of colonialism have on the lives of the people in this film? Understanding that this is a film that is set during the colonial period, is the mundane reality of their lives a reflection of life under colonization, or is it proof that the colonization perhaps does not have as great of an impact as we might imagine. Do the characters in this movie live sort of beyond the reach of colonialism? Is the nature of their sort of remote rural existence a rejoinder to the idea that colonization is a complete, is kind of complete and far-reaching and omnipresent, right? On the one hand, we can imagine perhaps their poverty as a consequence of a colonial system. On the other hand, we might see their existence as, evidence of the fact that while colonialism in theory is a kind of totalizing system, in practice there are corners of, places that are technically colonized, in which the sort of, at least the sort of aesthetic and intellectual consequences of colonialism are not evident, even if the economic consequences are very much with the colonized. I think another question that we could ask, if we're acknowledging that this is a film that is, as part of the parallel cinema movement, trying to explore what authentic Indian film is, trying to explore or sort of realism, both in terms of narrative and in terms of the kind of characters who are being represented, is it problematic to locate authenticity in the rural sphere? One of the things that I think one of the traps we often get into in the United States, right, is this idea of real America. And the real America that we imagine, not that we imagine, because I'm sure many people in this class don't imagine America in this way, but when we hear politicians and newscasters talk about real America on television, typically what they're talking about is sort of Iowa farmland, right? It's sort of small town, Midwest, Central Plains. I think this is a fairly common trope when people are trying to sort of build a nationalist identity. Oftentimes what is actually used to stand in, to symbolize that nationalist identity, is a kind of idealized pastoral or rural setting, and the people who occupy that setting. And so I think another question we get asked then is, is this that? Is Satyajit Ray sort of using these characters to propose that what it means to be sort of authentically Indian is to be rural? I think, a good question that we could ask might be, would it be possible to make a kind of authentic Indian cinema based in Calcutta or based in Delhi or based in a city? What does a sort of everyday life story look like in an urban setting? We could ask the same thing about the United States, I think. But beyond this, so, if we do take my basic assumption that, that this is a story that takes place under colonialism, not after, but that it's filmed after colonialism, and that in part it is a reflection on both the kind of remoteness and sort of omnipresence of colonialism for this rural pocket of individuals. And if we also take my assumption that, it is important to think about rural populations, and that, for many people who are building a nationalist identity, rural life becomes a kind of symbol and a stand-in for that. What is the actual relationship to modernity that is being expressed here? What is the relationship to the outside world that is being expressed here? Where do we see evidence of colonialism coming through in this film? I think these are all questions that we can ask. And again, I'm not sort of giving you answers because I don't know that there are answers. I think these are just the kinds of things I want you to be thinking about when you're watching a film like this. or after you've watched it, these are the kinds of things I want you to be reflecting upon and noticing. I chose this image to sort of anchor this part of my, kind of discussion because, as I'm sure you will remember, those of you who watched the film, this image is from the scene where Apu and Durga go to the train tracks. They go through this, huge fields, beautifully shot scene, and they see along the way these power lines, right, that are cutting through the countryside. And I think this is, the train, the power lines. There's a couple other scenes. I think there's a scene with a merchant when they go into town. A man with a box of photographs showing faraway places. You know, there are moments. There's a scene, I think, with a marching band, with a kind of Western-style marching band. There are moments in which this almost atemporal, timeless, rural tale that could be set almost any place and any time, this tale is punctuated by these moments where we're reminded, right? We're reminded that this is the 20th century. We're reminded that this is a colonial context. We're reminded that the world outside has a lot going on in it, even though the sort of daily pace of life in this village in Bengal is quite slow. And so I want us to be thinking about, these are not, this whole film is fictional, right? This whole film is an act of imagination. All of the shots that are captured in this film are intentional, right? All of the choices that Ryan makes in constructing this narrative are intentional. And so, I want us to be aware that in a film that is so overwhelmingly rural, when you do get these scenes of sort of encountering the power line, encountering the train, encountering the brass band, encountering, bric-a-brac from the outside world, these are all choices that Rai is making, and it's, I think, intended to kind of jar us out of the, what might otherwise be a completely kind of romanticized pastoral story. I don't think he's trying to somehow, express that, rural life is somehow more authentically Indian than urban life. I don't think he's trying to express somehow that these people are outside of the reach of colonialism. I think in a way he's almost challenging that assumption. He's challenging the assumption that somehow there is a part of sort of almost an ancient Indian way of life that is preserved or that can be returned to completely. I think part of the reason that we see that even these individuals have their lives shaped by technology and shaped by knowledge of the outside world is that, even here, even in the most rural places in the world, not just in India, but in the world, under modernity, and particularly under colonialism, there is a awareness that they too are modern, right? This is a story about sort of modern rural people. And that's another identity, right? This is a class that's about, identity, multiculturalism, and empire. I think one of the things that the story is a really beautiful example of is a modern, rural, colonial existence, which is really complex. We don't think about, we oftentimes don't think about rural life in that way, right? We tend to think about rural life as somehow ancient. And it's not. I think one of the things that this film is really trying to show is the complexities of what it means to be an Indian person, to be a South Asian person at this particular moment in history, in the, middle part of the 20th century. Another aspect of this film that I want to highlight is the kind of gender aspect. So, I think on the right you may recognize this is Abanindranath Tagore's Bharat Mata, Mother India from 1905. This is one of the most famous pieces of work to come out of the Bengal school, which we talked about last time. It is a sort of symbol of India that is generated the same year that the Swadeshi movement sort of formally takes shape. It's the same year that Great Britain tries to divide the state of Bengal into two halves, and in response you have all of these artists and thinkers trying to decolonize themselves aesthetically, intellectually, culturally, politically, economically. And that is the Swadeshi movement, right? And the Bengal school is a kind of aesthetic wing of the Swadeshi movement to a certain extent. I think it is not by accident that in response to the attempt to divide and conquer on the part of the British, Indian people, South Asian people, created an image of India in the form of a woman. I think a nation is an abstract concept, particularly before it even exists, right? At this moment in history in 1905, Bengal, all of India, all of Pakistan, all of Bangladesh, they're all part of the British Raj. They're all colonial holdings of England, of Great Britain. And, prior to that, there was no sort of unified India. Prior to the sort of incursion of the British and the consolidation of that part of the world under the British Raj, there were sort of a series of adjacent kingdoms and princedoms, a kind of pastiche of different religions and ethnicities. But, in 1905 you have South Asian people living under British rule trying to imagine what a nation state could look like. And so that's a very abstract idea. And when you're trying to imagine something that doesn't exist, it becomes necessary to represent it, to create some kind of form to put your ideas into, to come up with some kind of symbol that can stand in for this concept of a nation state. And I think in the case of India in particular, it has been historically a lot easier for Indian artists, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, to conceive of India as a woman, as a human body, and specifically a female human body, than it has been for them to conceive of India as land. Right? One thing that we'll see over and over again in Indian art and poetry and literature and song and film, as I will mention in a bit with Pattar Panchali, is that the idea of India as a woman, imagining India as a woman who is worth sort of fighting for, who is worth defending, but who also suffers, who also bears the suffering of the Indian people, is a recurring trope. So on the sort of larger subject of identity and imperialism or colonialism, I think one of the things we need to think about is how do you imagine yourself as an individual, but how do collectives of people imagine themselves collectively? And one of the ways that we imagine ourselves collectively are through these symbols. And in the case of India, one of the most important symbols, particularly during the lead up to independence, is this idea of the Indian woman as a stand-in for the nation as a whole. And I think that is something that we see also in in Pather Panchali. Um, even though technically it's part of this three-part series, which is, or trilogy, that's oftentimes referred to as the Apu trilogy, because Apu, the young boy in Pather Panchali, appears in all three films, and the films sort of trace the course of his life. Particularly in Pather Panchali, the characters that we get the most actual time with are not Apu or Harihar or any of the male characters, but we're really living in the world of women. We're really focusing, one of the most distinctive shots in the whole film, for me at least, to answer my own question that I posed to you this week, is this, early on in the film, this image of Durga, right? And she's staring, I believe, into a pot where there's kittens, if I'm remembering correctly, where there's kittens in this pot. But the camera is put inside the pot, and so you get this like really beautiful kind of telescoped image of her face. It really focuses on her, and I think is intended to highlight how important she is to this narrative. And I think both the mother character and Durga are really, from a narrative standpoint, from a acting standpoint, from a screen time standpoint, are really the leads of this film. Right? They are the people who we spend the most time with. They're the people with whom I think we are intended to sort of identify the most. In many ways, Durga is the protagonist of this film. And I think for a film that is being filmed right on the sort of in the immediate aftermath of independence, a film that is trying to conceptualize what it means for India to be independent, Durga and her mother both become a kind of stand-in for the suffering of the nation, and also for the dreams of the nation, right? They hold both the aspirations and the failures of this fledgling nation. And I think the great tragedy of Durga's death in this film is again a kind of perhaps romanticized way of thinking about suffering, thinking about national suffering. Durga isn't just a girl, she is a kind of symbol of for the consequences of poverty. She's a kind of symbol for all of the sort of hopes and aspirations of young Indians that may be denied because of poverty. One of the things that we see is that Sarabajaya, the mother in the film, feels a lot more rooted to reality in a way. Of all the four characters in the film, she is the one who I think is the most embarrassed by her circumstances. She's the one who whose desires are the most concrete, right? She is really just concerned with having enough rice every day. She's really concerned with having enough clothes to put on her children's backs. She's concerned with having a roof and windows for when the storm comes. Those are her aspirations. Her aspirations are quite mundane. They're quite basic. They're quite oriented towards survival. Whereas Harihar and both children, Durga and Apu, are able to have much more abstract dreams, much more fanciful dreams, whether it has to do with freedom, with marriage, with pretty things like a necklace, whether it has to do with being a celebrated poet or playwright. One of the things that I asked you to think about, and many of you chose to respond to this particular prompt, at least those of you who've responded thus far, was about the question of aspirations, right? About the question of dreams. I think in our discussion of sweat, when we were breaking down all the different ways to describe the various intersectional identities of the characters, um, one of the things that I really try to impress upon you is that identity is so much more than race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, gender, religion, right? We identify, even in terms of collective identities, right? We identify um, across so many different categories that many of which are not tied to the appearance of our physical bodies. And I think one of the sort of categories of identity, one of the ways in which we identify as individuals and one of the ways in which we identify with each other, with others, is through this idea of aspiration, right? We are as much our dreams and aspirations as we are our races, our genders, etc. Um, and I think, that's one thing we talked about in terms of like Chris wanting to go to college and Jason feeling very alienated by discovering that Chris wants to go to college, right? So there's, and Chris, or Jason rather, having built up his identity around his particular dream of opening a Dunkin' Donuts in Florida, right? So um, what we dream really does impact how we see ourselves and also, how other people see us. Um, and we return to that theme, I think, in this film. The question of dreams, the question of aspirations looms quite large for Apu and his family. So I wanted to show you a quick clip of a short film, a black and white short film that Rai was commissioned to make in 1964 by PBS as part of their Esso World Theater sort of program series. Esso was, I don't know if it still is, but it was a large multinational oil company in the 1960s and 70s. But at any rate, he was commissioned by PBS to make one part of a series of these short world theater films. He was actually originally requested to film in English or to write a film that would be scripted or spoken in the English language. And Rai ends up actually sidestepping that request because, again, he's coming out of parallel cinema. This is less than a decade after Pather Panchali. This is less than 5 years after the final film in the Apu trilogy is released. He's still very much entrenched in sort of trying to explore what it means to make authentic Indian cinema and also really interested in realism. And so rather than acquiesce to PBS requests, rather than try to sort of fit his aesthetic into an English language format, he chose instead to make this short film a silent film. And it's not completely silent, as you'll see. There's music, but it is without speech. It's a kind of pantomime between two small children. And this is another example. We can talk a little bit about it after I play it for you. But here's another example of Rai using the medium of film to explore the relationship between caste, socioeconomics, and desire. Exploring how these various aspects of our identities combine to sort of help us understand our place in the world. So we'll play this. It's about 9 minutes long. Oh, 12 minutes, I guess. So I think really clearly, right, if we look at that film, we see that without words, we're learning about who these boys essentially and fundamentally are. So, in this instance, we have one young boy who, you know, has everything and whose desire seems primarily oriented towards dominating everyone and showing that he has everything. Whereas the other boy, who I think are to understand, um, perhaps lives on the property owned by the other boy's family, not only values what he has, but also seems to have a sense of a desire for more that is rooted in imagination as opposed to rooted in a desire for dominance. And this is a really subtle and complex, I think, but also relatively straightforward portrait that Rai paints, which I think really can help us explore um, how complex identity is, particularly in a colonial or post-colonial society. In this case, we see an impoverished family in the sort of most rural area of Bengal, but they still have aspirations. One of the critiques of this film that has been sort of frequently made is that it idealizes poverty, right? Is that it uses poverty as a kind of symbol for virtue and romanticizes the experience of poverty. Be that as it may, and whether or not that's a critique that resonates with you, I think part of the reason that Rai chooses to situate his film within the context of a community of poor people is that the reality of India is that many, many, many people are poor, right? Most people in India are poor. There are more poor people in India than there are rich people in India, by far. And so to the extent that he's interested in realism, and not in sort of perpetuating a sort of elitist fantasy, it's necessary to look at the experiences of the poor. But also, I think, to the extent that this film is written at a moment when India, it's not actually written, because I said last time that he didn't actually write a script, but the film is conceived, the film is sort of translated or adapted during a time when the nation of India, the newly independent nation of India, is trying to dream for itself, trying to imagine, trying to do the creative labor of imagining a future for itself outside of colonialism, beyond the shackles of colonialism. I think it's not a coincidence that thematically this film is about dreams. It's about both the possibility and the impossibility of aspiration. And, I think one of the beauties, one of the benefits of having the main characters in this film be poor is that it sort of emphasizes the fact that, dreams are not solely the province of the wealthy or the privileged. I think oftentimes we think, even when we are ourselves experiencing financial hardship, I think it can be easy to get caught up in the mindset that aspirations are a luxury, that aspirations are a privilege. I think oftentimes the poor are dehumanized, and we imagine those of us who happen to not be poor would like to imagine that they don't have aspirations. And I think that, a key aspect of this film is to sort of point out that everybody has dreams, and there is no limit on that. There is no situation on earth so dire that the human spirit will not find a way to aspire. And that, in fact, that is a key component of what makes us human. having some sort of aspiration beyond our own experience. I think one of the things that makes this film unique, and actually I think I'm gonna come back to these slides in a second. I think in that vein, as an exploration of as an exploration of aspirations under the conditions of poverty, one of the things that makes this film unique, and also I would say distinctly Indian, as opposed to the kind of exploration that we saw in Sweat, is that it's not only about aspiration and poverty, it's also about caste, which is a category of identity. It's sort of a category to which people belong, with which people identify in India, in the Indian subcontinent, that is unique to that particular region of the world. Right? I think in the United States, we understand socioeconomics, right? We understand wealth and poverty, we understand education and lack thereof, but caste is actually quite distinct from socioeconomic class as it exists in much of the Western world. And I want to, highlight that a little bit, because I think it's a really, giving a little bit of an exploration, and I'm not an expert on caste by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's important to understand, to fully grasp the action in this film, but also I think it's just an interesting, provides an interesting dimension to the larger questions of identity, multiculturalism, and empire. So, caste. The idea of caste is traced back to the ancient Vedic texts. The Vedic texts are sort of the oldest religious texts in Hinduism. They date back about 1,000 BCE or BC. So the ancient Vedic texts are approximately, at this point, 3,000 years old. So the idea of caste can be traced back to these ancient Vedic texts. The actual name caste, C-A-S-T-E, though, comes from the Portuguese, who misattributed the strict social hierarchy that they observed in certain communities as a racial one. Casta, which is the origin of the word caste, actually means race or breed in Portuguese. So in the ancient Vedic texts that speak of caste, as we have come to know it, the term used to describe this structure, or this way to structure society, is actually Varna. Varna spelled V-A-R-N-A. At least in English it's spelled that way. So Varna is actually the sort of indigenous way of describing what has been termed caste. And if you've heard about this system at all in India, you've probably heard about it as the caste system. But Varna or Varnas are the way that they're actually referred to in the original ancient texts. The basic idea of Varna or caste is that society is divided up into 4 major groups, defined by their karma or work and their dharma or duty. Those 4 groups are the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, the Shudras, and the Dalits. Well, actually, the Dalits, we'll talk about the Dalits later, but the four categories actually are the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. The Brahmins are the priests and other intellectuals. The Kshatriyas are kings, warriors, leaders. The Vaishyas are traders, merchants, etc., farmers, sometimes large-scale farmers. And the Shudras are workers, laborers, people who work with their hands. The system has since evolved several thousand subcastes, or jatis, which means that sort of within each of these larger categories, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, etc., there are subcategories and then subcategories within those categories. And each of those jatis are essentially profession-related guilds that correspond to specific work that an individual does. The four larger varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, are often mapped onto the body of Brahma, the supreme creator deity in the Hindu pantheon, where Brahmins are represented as the head of Brahma, Kshatriyas are represented as his arms, Vaishyas are represented as his legs or thighs, and Shudras are represented as his feet. So this is a kind of metaphor. It's the way that in the Vedic texts and today, Indians have conceived of both the relationship between these castes and each other, and also the relationship between each individual caste and society as a whole. This has led, I think, in some people's minds, to an assumption that these varnas always existed in a strict hierarchy. But this fact, in recent years, has been increasingly challenged by South Asian Vedic scholars. Over time, a social segregation and caste prejudice deepened. And as the sort of prejudice, particularly against Shudras, deepened, another layer of Shudras emerged at the base of this structure, that meaning known as Dalits. So Dalits, if you've ever heard anyone referred to as an untouchable, that means that they are Dalit. Dalit literally means divided, split, broken, or scattered in classical Sanskrit, which is the ancient language in which the Vedic texts are written. Not only, traditionally at least, were Dalits banned from sharing food with or marrying people from higher castes, but some couldn't even brush the shadow of a Brahmin. And Dalits, traditionally, in terms of their labor, remember that caste or varna is determined by your duty and work, sort of what work you are fated to perform in life. Dalits traditionally are street cleaners, sometimes people who handle the dead, people who clean out latrines and toilets. So it's the people who do work that is tainted, literally and also socially. They got the name Untouchables, to which I think many of you may be most familiar, because their mere touch could supposedly defile non-Dalits, and that's again because of the nature of the work that they do. Not all Dalits in South Asia are Hindu. Dalit Muslims, in fact, many of whom descended from lower caste Hindus who converted to Islam in an effort to escape the repression of the caste system, continue to face prejudice from non-Dalit Hindus and Muslims, and that's according to a 2016 study. Just to give a sense of proportion, and again, this is speaks to my earlier point about sort of why Satyajit Ray may have chosen to focus his first film on a family of impoverished people. In particular, well, anyways, and this gets complicated because, as I will mention it shortly, poverty does not actually directly correlate to caste. But just to give you a sense of the relative sort of demographic proportion of these different castes or varnas within South Asian society, Dalits currently form about 17% of the total population of India, and more like 24% of the population in the state of West Bengal, or, where this film is set. Brahmin families, by contrast, at least at present, account for only about 5% of the total population. So there are far fewer Brahmins than there are Dalits. By far the largest demographic, though, of Indians belong to the Shudra Varna. Over 50% of Indians are Shudras, laborers, right? People who work with their hands, who don't necessarily own property, who don't have any position of social esteem, either educational or political. So one thing that's interesting, I think, about the particular condition of the family that is highlighted in Patar Panchali is that they are obviously impoverished, and that might lead you to assume that they are Dalits or perhaps Shudras. But in fact, they are Brahmins, right? This is actually a film about a Brahmin family that is poor. Despite being highly educated to this day, and Brahmins have the highest literacy rate by far, obviously, if they're priests and teachers, that makes sense. But Brahmins have the highest literacy rate by far of any Varna. But despite being highly educated, many Brahmins have lived and continue to live in poverty. So in fact, this is a form of identity particular to India, which is neither racial nor ethnic nor even socioeconomic in the strictest sense, right? So there is, this family is of sort of high Varna, it's a high caste family. They have caste privilege in that, for example, Harihar sends Apu to school. Harihar himself is a poet and a playwright, so he is educated, he's literate, and he sort of shares that literacy with his family. However, they are so poor that they can barely eat, and they can barely maintain their home. So this is a particular sort of category of person, the sort of highly educated, deeply impoverished person, that is relatively common in India, but quite a bit less common in the United States, right? In the United States, the entire point of education is social mobility, right? And that's one of the things we talked about a couple lectures ago, that I talked about a couple lectures ago, right? The whole idea of education, particularly in a capitalist society, is to sort of buy access to social mobility, to buy access to success, to economic stability. Part of the reason that, Jason is so sort of scornful about Chris's choice of how he would like to spend his life is that he's like, you want to be a teacher? That doesn't pay anything, right? Teachers make nothing. And I think, in the United States, it's while it's true that sometimes an education doesn't always lead to wealth, there is a sense that there is an economic trade-off for an education, right? Teachers might not make as much as some factory workers, but there's a kind of support network, essentially, for the educated in the United States. Since this is a class about not only identity, but also colonialism or imperialism and how one impacts the other, I thought it'd be interesting to expand this conversation about caste, about Varna in India, to think about how colonialism actually impacted the so-called caste system. The social categories of religion and caste, as they are perceived in modern-day India and throughout the rest of the world, were developed actually during British colonial rule. So I've already mentioned that Varna is ancient, but caste as we now understand it, those of you who may have heard of caste before, really is a relatively modern invention that dates to the British Raj and the immediately previous period of involvement with the East India Trading Company. The British established the acceptable list of indigenous religions in India during their rule. So, one of the things that I think I've mentioned, and if not, please let me know, is that the system of rule that the British used in India was known as indirect rule, which means that not only that they used pre-existing power structures through which to rule, meaning that they sort of co-opted and appropriated the existing sort of princes and other rulers sort of into the machinery and the structure of the British Empire. It also means that in terms of establishing laws for their South Asian colony, they turned to what they thought of as traditional customs. They attempted, at least, to sort of base some of their laws for India on what they perceived as sort of traditional Indian ways of structuring society. And as a part of that, they established an acceptable list of indigenous religions for their Indian subjects. Those acceptable religions included Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism. And the boundaries and laws that they established around these religions, they claimed at least were based on traditional texts, on their readings of ancient Indian texts. So again, they're turning to the Vedas to sort of help define what these categories are. Also, in their attempts to establish indirect rule in India, the British colonizers invented or essentially constructed Indian social identities using categories of convenience during a period that covered roughly the 19th century. And these categories were institutionalized in sort of the mid part of that century, in the sort of mid to late 19th century, through a census. So this is actually an image of a Dalit leader on the left. Remember, Dalits are that sort of subcategory of worker that is sometimes known as untouchable, speaking with a British colonial officer in the early 20th century. And as you can see in this image, the British colonial officer is himself Indian, right? So, the British Raj was largely administered through Indian middlemen who were sort of pre-existing leaders. Now, the logic that the British used to codify what they saw as the traditional caste system into law by way of censuses and other measures was the same logic that caused them to attempt to partition Bengal in 1905 and led to the eventual partition of India into India and Pakistan at independence. The logic behind both of those gestures, both of those sort of actions, is the idea that a nation is easier to govern when there is a single uniform population that is governed by its own traditional values and rules. Essentially, in the British Raj, the British Empire was afraid of multiculturalism, was afraid of diversity. And so the idea behind, for example, codifying which religions were allowed in India and which religions were not, was that certain religions share certain principles, can therefore be governed by ancient Vedic principles. Other religions, like, for example, Islam, are not compatible with Hinduism and therefore have to be governed separately. What ends up happening as a result, between the middle part of the 19th century and the middle part of the 20th century, when South Asia, which is here, everything sort of south of this red line, everything in Asia south of the Himalayan mountains, from the 19th century until this area of the world gains its independence, is that what was once an incredibly culturally, ethnically, religiously, and socially diverse subcontinent, with much more fluid ideas about religion, social class, movement, social structure, and hierarchy, became a much more balkanized and rigid society. And balkanized, I don't know if that's a word you're familiar with, but it comes from Balkans, which is sort of Central Eastern Europe, the small countries, southwest of Russia, like Serbia, Croatia, etc. And that the term balkanization or balkanized literally just means that instead of a multicultural unit, you have lots of little units, each of which is at least attempting to be ethnically or culturally homogenous. So the resulting categorical system that the British sort of created, supposedly based on these ancient Hindu ideals for India, became rigid and increasingly rigid over the course of, the next century and a quarter, from roughly 1850 until the middle part of the 20th century, as institutionalized categories came to be associated with real rights. So this is something that we talked about very early in the semester when I was sort of introducing you all to the history of apartheid and the idea that colonialism oftentimes exacerbates or even in some instances creates difference, right? And what I was referring to there applies here also, where you take a category, where you either choose a pre-existing category or create a new category of people, and then give them different access to resources, be they financial, educational, and so you attach real material outcomes to arbitrary identity markers, and over time that can create real difference where before there was none. So this is not to say that, prior to the British Empire, Hinduism and Islam were sort of mutually exchangeable or interchangeable, or that, people in South Asia did not recognize differences between varnas, between religions, etc. But many of those distinctions were much more porous and much more flexible, and under the British, those categories became ossified. The word ossified comes from the root ossa, which means bone, so it became rigid, right? Became much more fluid boundaries became rigid, because the British attached real material outcomes to these different categories and assigned specific territorial regions also to these different categories. In 1948, the founders of post-colonial India actually outlawed caste discrimination or discrimination based on Varna and enshrined a form of affirmative action in the Constitution that included reserving government jobs and places in higher education for Dalits. And again, Dalits are the group at the bottom rung of the caste system who number more than 200 million people in present-day India. Yet, Varna or caste remains a significant factor in deciding everything from family ties and cultural traditions to educational and economic opportunities, especially in small towns and villages where more than 70% of Indians live. So again, back to this question of why Rai chooses to focus on a kind of rural setting. Much of India is rural. We are maybe more aware of places like Delhi or Bombay or Calcutta, but the reality is that, roughly 70% or more of Indians you know, the last 50 years have lived in small towns and villages in relatively rural areas. Nearly a third of Dalits, just to give you a sense of what it means to be Dalit in present day India, nearly a third of Dalits make less than $2 a day, and many don't have access to education or running water. Most menial jobs are carried out by Dalits. Very few office jobs are held by Dalits. So, I was talking about how, you know, caste does not track directly with socioeconomics, in that there are impoverished upper caste people in India, and that is certainly true. However, disproportionately, the poor in India are Dalits. Disproportionately, people who are undereducated in India are Dalits. In present day India, many of these caste positions have become associated with specific family names. So actually, there's a reason why the vast majority of Hindu South Asian Americans have one of a handful of last names. And that's because of sort of the kinds of people who tend to have access to immigration to America, who tend to have economic privilege, who tend to come here. So we have names like Patel, Chakrabarti, Gupta. These are all upper caste names. Chakrabarti or Chowdhury, that's a Brahmin name. Gupta is actually a Vaishya name, it's a merchant name. So many of, again, if you think of the kinds of last names that you hear here in the United States, those are almost exclusively upper caste names that are associated with specific kinds of professions. Now, for the rest of lecture today, what I really want to focus on is broadening out from just thinking about the medium of film to thinking about photographic media more generally, because both of the readings for Friday are about photography and its relationship to colonialism. And I want us to be thinking about sort of how it is that photography relates to colonialism, and also perhaps why it is that in this larger quest to quote-unquote decolonize the mind, photography has again and again become a favorite medium for artists of color in the global south, be they on the continent of Africa, on the subcontinent of India, or elsewhere in the world. So a little bit of background information about photography. If we were in class, what I would say right now is, does anybody know when photography was invented? And then somebody would probably Google it, and somebody else probably raise their hands and guess something that would be wrong. Or maybe somebody would know, because I'm sure many of you are yourselves photographers. And then I would, use that as a stalling tactic. And then I would eventually tell you that photography first became commercially available, at least, though the exact invention of it is contested, in 1839, with the introduction to the market of something called a daguerreotype. A daguerreotype, which was named for its inventor, Frenchman Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre, was the first publicly available photographic process, and it was a single positive image exposed on a silver-plated copper surface. So it was not, if I don't know how much you know about film photography because you're all so young, and I'm sure by the time you were really coming of age, digital was the sort of primary way of taking and also of sharing images. But for, at least, for at least 150, if not, at least 150 years from, the beginning of the technology until the sort of late part of the 20th century, most film photographs required both a positive and a negative image, right? So you would get, in the actual camera itself, what you would be capturing would be a negative image, and then in the printing process, you would translate that negative image to a positive image. So the light and dark values, the color values would all be inverse of what they would appear in the final print. But the daguerreotype actually predates this positive negative film format, and you would get a single unique physical positive image that again was exposed on a a silver plated rather copper surface. And the materials that were actually used in the production of the daguerreotype gave it a very precise kind of mirror-like quality that when it was first introduced seemed really miraculous to a public that was previously only used to artist renderings, used to drawings and etchings and paintings. Photography seemed almost like magic, almost like capturing life. I think it is. Oh, and this is the sort of lower left corner are two examples of daguerreotypes. The image on the right is actually one that has been overpainted. That was a relatively common practice. Daguerreotypes were seen as so lifelike, and that they were often altered to make them feel even more lifelike with sort of watercolors or other kinds of paints sort of on top of the print. Okay, or on top of the image. And in the upper right-hand corner gives you a sense of all of the materials that were required for the daguerreotype. So this is not like a point-and-click kind of camera. It required, silver plate. It required various different boxes and with different kinds of apertures. It required clamps and stands and a basin for washing the plate. So there's a surface for buffing the plate. So it was a very complex multi-step purpose. And so despite the fact that it sort of appeared as this perfectly lifelike and almost automatic image, the reality is that there was quite a bit of human labor and sort of craft and technique that went into the production of daguerreotypes. Now, essentially immediately after the photograph was invented, it really got put to work pretty quickly in various colonial endeavors. That is to say that cameras were taken on expeditions by colonial governments. Cameras were taken on expeditions by anthropologists and ethnographers from places like Great Britain and France, on expeditions to sub-Saharan Africa, on expeditions to North Africa, on expeditions to South and Southeast Asia. And these cameras were really used not only to record what was seen for posterity, but also really to assert dominance over these lands and their people. So two of the sort of most common ways in which cameras were used during the colonial period by European travelers, either directly or indirectly linked to colonial governments, were landscapes like these. And I think a really common sort of aesthetic of these early colonial landscapes was a really sort of vast expanse, right, where you get a sense of receding space. Both of these, these are only two examples. The example on the top was taken by a Scottish doctor named John Murray, who was based near Agra in India with his regiment of the British East India Company. This is sort of right around the time that there's a transition from the East India Company to the Raj. And he was, an avid photographer and took a lot of the early pictures of India. But, if we look at this, for example, this image of the Taj Mahal, taken from the banks of the river Yamuna, it's kind of inviting, right? There's this sense that the photographer is standing at a position of, um, he's sort of surveying all the land that that belongs to him. There's a kind of sense that the land is exposing itself to the camera. There's a kind of clear pathway into the scene. The Samuel Bourne photograph immediately below follows the same kind of layout, right? Where you've got a sort of, relatively high up vantage point from which you're seeing an expansive landscape, and then you're also sort of being given a path into the image by way of sort of flowing river. Another really common form of colonial photography were these kinds of pseudo-scientific, deeply racist, oftentimes coerced images of colonial subjects. This particular image was taken by German colonial and military officer Max Weiss, who was stationed in German East Africa, which went on to become Uganda during the early part of the 20th century before World War One. This particular photograph, and which was actually part of a series, was taken during a time when Max Weiss was serving as a topographer on an expedition, a quote-unquote scientific expedition of Central Africa. And I should say, there's a lot that can be said about this image. I think, for me, it's a deeply uncomfortable image. Because of the sexual connotations of it, but also because of the coercive connotations of it, right? These young women are obviously not being photographed, at least entirely, sort of with their own consent. This seems to be a relatively coerced image. And they're also not being photographed necessarily as individuals or as people so much as they're being photographed as specimens, as sort of scientific specimens. And the photograph itself is emphasizing their exoticness, their difference, and using their nude bodies as a kind of, both as a sort of erotic spectacle, but also as a kind of dehumanizing frame within which to see them as sort of less worthy of, of liberty. So at any rate, these are the kinds of images. We get landscapes, we get these deeply dehumanizing photographs. And, as the 20th century wears on, photographs of colonies, both of colonial people and of colonial landscapes, become so popular that they sort of enter the rotation of the sort of stereoscope, which was a popular pastime in the early part of the 20th centuries, a kind of precursor to the viewfinders of the 1980s and 90s, which you may or may not be too young to remember. Stereoscopes essentially were these sort of bilateral photographs that were taken a couple of inches to a couple of feet apart of the same view, and then they would be combined into these slides, which would then be viewed through a finder like this to create the illusion of a three-dimensional space. So in sort of all of these instances, you have photographs of colonized lands and of colonized people being presented either to, in the case of these two images, to other people intimately involved in the colonization process, or in the case of the stereoscope, being presented to sort of the general public in the metropole as readily digestible information. And in fact, the act of digesting foreign people and lands as information became a way of asserting power over those people and lands. The idea that I can sit in my home in London or Essex or, Scotland somewhere. And I can put a slide of, Palestinian women at the Wailing Wall or of, a zebra hunt in Namibia or any number of other scenes into my viewfinder and sitting in my sort of brocade couch, I can then feel as if I understand something about this land and this people. It's a kind of power play, right? It's a kind of like I am using technology and the dominance of the empire to which within which I am sort of centrally located in order to um, sort of assert my superiority to or reinforce society's sort of agreed upon notion that I am in fact superior to these other people in these other places. I am in a position to, in a sort of in one fell swoop, to absorb information about them and to sort of process and digest that information for myself. It's not a reciprocal relationship, right? So, people in Palestine or Zimbabwe or East Africa are not in a position to, sit in their homes and think that based on a few brief snippets of information that they understand or somehow can intellectually lord it over people in Scotland or the United States or France, etc. Um, so, I think what I'm talking about here may seem very abstract, and I think it'll become more concrete once we have something to read and to sort of hook these ideas onto. Um, so I'm just going to introduce the two texts for Friday, and then I'll go back over these in some more greater length. I'm going to just skim through some images, and then we can talk more in depth. I will talk more in depth in Friday's lecture. But we are going to be reading two texts for Friday. One is called The Colonial Backdrop by a very important Indian-born, American-based scholar named Arjuna Padarai. He was born in Bombay, but has taught here in the United States at Brandeis and the he was educated at Brandeis and at the University of Chicago. He actually taught here in Philadelphia, at Penn in the 1980s and 90s. He is an incredibly important scholar of post-colonial studies, of globalization studies, of the nation state and its relationship to globalization and post-colonialism. And in this very famous essay that I'm having you read for Friday, he takes on the subject of colonial photography, specifically through the lens of what he calls the backdrop. I'm just gonna give you some more images of specifically photographs of colonized people, so you can start to get a sense when you're reading his text of the kinds of things he's referencing. So this on the right is a photograph from one of the sort of largest and most definitive collections of ethnographic photographs taken under the British in India. It's actually from an ethnological work on the caste system, which we've been talking about today already. It's from a larger work called Castes and Tribes of Southern India. Again, remember the British were very interested in this idea of caste or varna. These were images that were taken by Edgar Thurston in 1909, who was the superintendent of ethnography for the Madras presidency from 1901 to 1915, and the superintendent of the Madras Government Museum later. So Padarai is talking about images like this. He's talking about images like these. On the left, taken in South Africa in the late 19th century. On the right, taken again in India in the late 19th century. He's talking about images like this. On the left, there's a carte de visite, which we'll talk about next time, which was taken in South Africa in the late 19th century. He's talking about images like these on the right, which appear as part of the design on a deck of playing cards that was issued out of Amsterdam in the Netherlands during the 1940s of the various peoples that had been colonized by the Netherlands, peoples of different types of people, primarily in Southeast Asia. So these are the kinds of colonial images that he's referring to in this text. Here are some other examples, just to give you a sense, right, of what these kind of colonial era photographs look like. Okay. Now, we'll talk about this later. We'll talk about the things I just skipped over on Friday. The second text, by contrast, is an interview by a very important Malian photographer named Seydou Keita. So whereas Arjuna Padarai is mostly talking about photographs taken by colonizers of the colonized, Seydou Keita is an example of a formerly colonized person who got his start taking photographs of other people from his own city, from his own culture, from his own nation, in this case Bamako in Mali, French West Africa in the 1950s and 60s. I'm just going to scan through some other examples of his work, which I'll talk about more in depth on Friday. This on the right is not his work. This is a kind of compare and contrast that I'll be doing on Friday's lecture. And I just want to get to the questions, okay? So the questions for this week are, number 1, please give your definition of the word backdrop based on Padarai's essay, The Colonial Backdrop. How does he define that word as it relates to colonial photography? What kinds of things can be part of the quote-unquote backdrop of a photograph? Question number 2. The first section of the colonial backdrop is titled Resisting the Real. According to Padarai, what is the relationship between photography and the quote real, either under colonialism or in general? Option number 3 is, do you think Padarai's concept of the quote backdrop applies to the work of Seydou Keita? If so, how so? If not, why not? Remember, Seydou Keita is this gentleman here. So how do you think, essentially, question number 3 is essentially, how do you think these two texts relate? Can you understand Keita's work better by referring to Padarai's piece? If not, if you think that they don't relate, then explain why not. Okay, so choose one of these, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and there's more to come on Friday. All the best.